Open up your Bibles. We have a lot to talk about tonight. So I was teasing in the morning class this morning that everybody should bring their steak knife because we are moving from milk to meat tonight. Okay? So yeah, I told them this morning, beef is what's for Bible study. So yeah, I know, I thought it was clever, Jay. If only I could, talk like Sam Elliott, then it would have been better. But, I think what's really interesting about these passages tonight, as you guys were looking at them this week, did they strike you as important given where we live? Yes. And I think that these passages are really, really important because some of these teachings that we're looking at this week are things that are fundamental to Mormon theology. And so, as we're looking at this, I want us to kind of pay attention to the place where we live, the opportunities that we have living here and sharing this. And so, hopefully by the end of this evening, we would be able to tell someone who is a Mormon friend or neighbor or, loved one, family member, what exactly is the purpose of Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews. So, before we do that though, I want us to remember, how did the author start the book? What was his primary purpose from verse 1? What is it so important that he reminds the recipients of this letter to remember about Jesus?
That he's better than angels, better than Moses, better than everything.
Yeah, of who he is. That's the very first thing that he reminds them of in chapter 1 in verses 1 through 3. And what does he remind them of about his son?
He's the exact representation of the Father.
Yeah. He's the radiance of the Father, the exact representation of the Father. How did creation come to be? Through him, through his word. To see him is to see the Father. He has the very nature and character of the Father. And then he starts out in verse 3 of chapter 1 that what happened at some point in time.
He sat down at the right hand.
Yes, but only after he had done what? Made purification of sin, right? And so what we saw is that, like Ken was right, the author then goes on using this style of writing of the greater and the lesser to compare him to angelic beings, to Moses, to Joshua, to all of these kind of things. But then we get to chapter 4 when we were looking at entering this rest, and we were talking about that the author of the letter, he kind of focuses in on one specific time event for the nation of Israel, and he focuses in on one specific event in Christ's life that he kind of uses as touch points to talk about the points that he's making. What is the event or the time frame for the nation of Israel that the author kept bringing us back to?
The wandering.
The wandering, right? The wilderness generation, right? Those people who had been delivered by God from Egypt, how they had come in contact with him, how they had been given the law at Sinai, he had made a covenant with them, and their response to that, right? So what was the event that he kept bringing us back to regarding Jesus?
In chapter 4.
No, just whenever he talks about Jesus,
The high priest.
but what event made him a high priest?
He was selected by God, appointed by God.
He was appointed by God, but does he keep talking about when he suffered, the sacrifice, right? So what we saw is that the author talks about with the nation of Israel, it's the wilderness generation. In the New Testament, when he's talking about Christ, he's talking about the passion, like Good Friday, the crucifixion, and then the resurrection. Now, in the midst of all that discussion, though, he started talking about this idea of Christ being a high priest. Now, before we get started, what I want you to think about, because last week we were talking about who are the those in chapter 5. Do you remember? Or in chapter 6. When he was talking about, remember he says, you haven't grown up, you still have need of meat, And that whole discussion about them being immature, he kind of takes that side road because he says, I have a lot to tell you about Christ's priesthood in regards to the order of Melchizedek. But he says, but I can't talk to you now because you're too what?
Too weak.
You're too
Dull.
immature.
Oh, whoops, okay.
Right? You're too immature. He says you're still stuck in these elemental teachings, you're doing all of that kind of thing. But what we talked about, that immaturity in the author's mind does not equate to non-belief,
Right.
right? Because then he started out talking about, but those. Now, who were the those?
Those who heard the word but chose not to.
Okay.
Got
And-
experienced it all.
And they'd experienced the things of the church, they had heard the word, they had done this. And what were they choosing to go back to possibly?
Judaism and
Judaism, right? Because remember we talked about it last week. They probably would have thought that it wasn't that big of an issue to slide back into Judaism because you were still worshiping Yahweh. You would still have the law you could depend upon. You would still have the sacrificial system. You would still have all of those things. But what does the author say about that? Can they do that?
No.
No.
It's possible for those who've been enlightened to go back.
Right, and once you turn your back on what you come to know and understand, you cannot be brought back to repentance, right? Now, as we talk about chapter 7 today, and we're gonna actually go back to chapter 4 and read some of this stuff that he said about the priesthood. I want you to think about how difficult it would be if you had been raised in an environment where you were following God, you were living according to the law basically ruled everything in your life, to what you ate, to what you wore, to how you prayed, to how you engaged people every day in your community, right? It was part of how you saw yourself religiously before God with the priests and all of the sacrifices and everything like that. And then you had these other Jews come in and tell you, you need to change your whole perspective regarding that now. It was a staggering thing. And what I want you to think about that today, it's still the same thing. When we come to people and we offer them the gospel message and we offer them this alternative of who Christ is, and we try to show them these things, we think many times, well, because I possess truth and because I know what the Bible says and because of all this kind of thing, you should just listen to me, you should do what I tell you to do because I'm telling you the truth, and why wouldn't you do it? Because I've accepted it and I believe it. But that's not the way it goes.
Because it's like a total paradigm shift.
Yes, it's a total shift. And this is what I think is so important, what the author wants them to understand as he goes into this discussion. So what I'm hoping comes out of tonight is that when we have discussions with our friends and neighbors and family members who are LDS, that maybe we kind of take a step back and take a breath and go, you know what? We are asking them to make a hard turn. We are asking them to change their entire perspective upon who they are, who God is, how they're saved, all of that kind of thing when we talk to them about this. But I think that the information that we're going to talk about tonight is really information that for a lot of Christians, they never talk about it because we're not comfortable talking about it. And that is this understanding of the priesthood and how it's changed. So what is the purpose of a priesthood?
An intercessory between you and
Right.
God.
Right. Priests are intercessors, right? They intercede on the part of the people to God, and then they speak for God to the people. And we need to remember that. Now, a high priest, though, he carries other responsibilities than just what the regular priests carry. So turn over to chapter 4, and we're going to look at some of this real quick. So starting in chapter 4, we're going to start in verse 14. He says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, bless you, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weakness, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Therefore, let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest taken from among men is appointed on behalf of men in things pertaining to God, in order to offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and misguided, since he himself is beset with weakness. And because of it, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for sins, as for the people, so also for himself. And no one takes the honor to himself, but receives it when he is called by God, even as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself so as to become a high priest, but he said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And just as he said also in another passage, "You are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek." Now this is where the author then, in verse 10, he says that Christ is designated by God as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but he said, but concerning him, we have a lot to say,
But you're not ready.
but you're not going to be ready to hear it.
That's too bad, because I'd really like to have heard what he had to say.
Okay, well, that's what's beautiful about it, because he does go on and he tells them what he's going to say, right? But this is why he goes on and he says that they need to leave the elementary teachings in chapter 6. He starts talking about this. And then we get to verse 17 of chapter 6. He says, "In the same way, desiring even more to show to the heirs of the promise the unchangeableness of his purpose, interposed with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have believed have taken refuge, have strong encouragement to take hold of the hope set before us." Now, when we talked about this last week, what are the two unchangeable things that God cannot lie about in this passage? The promise and the oath, right? And so he says, but you have this hope, we have this hope, and then he describes hope. He says, this hope we have is an anchor of the soul, a hope both sure and steadfast, and one which enters within the veil, where Jesus has entered as a forerunner for us, having become a high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And last week when we looked at this, so what is the different visual that the author is putting forward to the readers of this letter? Under the Levitical priesthood with Aaron, what could the high priest not do? What was not allowed? Could he take anyone in there with him? No. Right? It was purely something he did on his own, with blood for his own sin first, and then he would bring blood for the sin of the people. But when he talks about Jesus, what is Jesus doing?
Bringing everybody.
He's taking his own
Yeah,
blood in there.
remember we talked about that he's gone through this veil. The veil is the curtain between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And it's basically like Jesus is just opening up that curtain and telling everybody who believes in him to do what?
Come on in.
Come on in. Draw near, how? With confidence. Right? This is this whole thing that the author's putting forward. They can walk through that veil with confidence because of who they're with. Now, but he makes very clear that he is not in the same order as the Levites and as Aaron. Okay?
On the same track.
Yeah, so now he's made this circle back around to Melchizedek. So we're going to read verses 1 through 3, and then we're going to stop, talk about those, and then we'll move on. Right? So it goes like it says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham as he was returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham portioned a tenth of all the spoils, was first of all, by the translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, which is King of Peace. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, he remains a priest perpetually." Okay, now, let's take this apart so that we understand what it's saying, because it's important that we understand what it's saying.
It's really important, because right here, you're gonna, in fact, there's still a strong argument, but it's not nearly as strong as an argument and my reading as I was going over today, thinking it through, was Christophany, right? But there's some words that lead you later to think it can't be that.
Okay, now.
But
in
everything else
witness-
leads to, yeah,
Alright.
there's something special here.
Okay, now, remember though, what is the context? What is the topic that the author is talking about? High priest,
Yeah.
priesthood, right? Now, when we went back last week, we talked about this in Genesis 14, where Moses writes about this event between Melchizedek and between Abraham. What did we understand from the historical narrative in chapter 14? Was Melchizedek a real person?
Yes.
Yes. And had he been functioning in two roles long before Abraham meets him?
Yes.
And what are those two roles?
He was a
Priest
king. Yeah.
and king, right? So what we see here is that he is not a Christophany, right?
Mhm.
And because in the Old Testament, when you have something about a Christophany, it's always preceded by, and the angel of the Lord, or something like that, to identify that the being that's gonna be talked about now is someone other than human, in a sense.
Yeah, okay, all right, so
Okay.
let's counter that though, because it does say without father, mother, without
Okay,
genealogy,
so
without
let's,
beginning or end.
now, okay, now, let's think about this as we go through it, all right? So let's clarify first of all, Melchizedek is a real person,
Yeah.
right? There's a real exchange between between Abram and Melchizedek. The question being, if this were a Christophany, why would Abraham have paid him a tithe? Right? You don't see that. You don't, and it's not given as worship. It's not given as anything like that, right? And this is, so we have to understand what a tithe represents here. But what it says is that he was, first of all, by the very translation of his name, what did his name mean?
King of righteousness.
Righteousness, right? Now, Zedek, at the end of Melchizedek, archaeologists have found that this is a dynastic name for a line of Jebusite kings that were there in Canaan. So what you see, he's part of a dynasty of kings, but he is, we are told, positionally before God seen as what? Righteous. His name means righteous, right? And then he goes, and then also king of Salem, and Salem means what? Peace. Okay? So what you see is that this is who he is positionally as he serves in the office of priest, but his kingdom as king is known as a kingdom of peace, right? Then he goes without father, without mother, without genealogy. So let's stop here. If you do not have an understanding of the Levitical priesthood and the importance of a family line regarding the high priest that is outlined in the law of Moses, would you care anything about a genealogy?
No, but let me stop you there for a
Okay,
second while I.
hold
Other
on,
than-
Carlson.
Sorry.
Other than the land that you are rightfully.
Okay, now, this is what I think is so interesting, because we interpret this like Ken is talking about, well, he had no beginning, he had no end, he had no mother, he had no father. You have to remember that in that period of time, the Jews were very particular about keeping genealogies and about keeping father, mothers, all of this kind of thing because of land ownership within the land, because of the priesthood, only certain people could hold the priesthood, all of that kind of thing. But for most people, they were born and they died and nobody really knew that much about them, right? There wasn't this extensive genealogy that was kept for anything. And so what you see here is that a lot of people live and die around the world with nobody knowing who their mother is, who their father is, what their family line is, anything like that. And that was Melchizedek. Now remember the two priesthoods that are being compared. One that hyper-focuses on those things, that goes through a tribe and through a family, and then one that stands alone. And that's what the author is talking about, right? So when it's talking about that he was without father, without mother, it's not talking that he just poof appeared one day, because Abraham has an encounter with a legitimate human being who is serving in this. So what do we know about him? He's human. If he's human, he has what?
A father and a mother.
He has a father and a mother. Now, the author just says there's no record of who his father and mother are. Okay? Then he goes on without genealogy. Now, if you are comparing this to the Levitical priesthood and to the line of Aaron, what was the most important thing in qualifying you to serve as a priest in the tribe of Israel?
You had to be a Levite.
You had to be a Levite, and to serve in the high priest, you had to be able to trace your lineage to who? Aaron. Right? That's why the Jews were extensive people who carried genealogies. Because what you see is that when land was supposed to revert back to the original owners, like in the Sabbath year and year of Jubilee and all of those kind of things, they kept extensive records to know who had what, who owned this, whose son was this, who should inherit, all of that kind of thing. But the rest of the world did not have that. Let me ask you guys, unless you come from an LDS background, how many of you have an extensive generational genealogy sitting in your house somewhere to tell you who you came from for the last 500 years? Glenn does. It's a Midwest thing. But see, but on a whole, we don't. You do? It's a Palmer. You know? Yeah. Okay. So this is what the author's talking about with Melchizedek, right? He didn't need all of that kind of stuff because he was not the same type of priest that what the Levites and Aaron were. Okay, so are we good there?
Mm-hmm.
Are we good?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So then he goes on and he says, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of days. Okay, this is another thing that in our
It's
culture,
not recorded.
it was never recorded, right? How many people around the world, their day that they were born, nobody really knows. It's around, I don't know, in the spring, right? And then when they die, nobody really knows. Well, I don't know, it was cold, okay? What we have to realize is most of the world is not fixated on the exact birth date of someone so it can be celebrated and all of that kind of thing. You're born and you die.
So, yeah, that's true. And not to jump the thing, but the next one, resembling the Son of God and remaining a priest forever, a little harder to overcome
Okay,
that one.
all right.
Let's
Now-
do it, woman. Let's hear it. Let's go.
I'm gonna get up and leave.
You're gonna-
Come on, Carl. You know these are burning questions in your heart too.
All the air is out of the balloon.
I know, see, it's just like I just removed all the mystery from Melchizedek, right? He's a nobody, but that's not
With
true.
no beginning
He's
and
a
no
huge
end.
somebody, okay? And that's the thing that the author's trying to talk about. Okay, so what we see here, now see, remember, it's all taken in context of the comparison of the priesthoods. So then it goes on and he says that he remains but made like the Son of God, right? Not that Jesus is made like Melchizedek, but Melchizedek, in a sense, is a foreshadowing of who?
Christ.
Christ. In what aspect?
Priest.
Remaining a priest
Priest.
forever.
Okay, remaining a priest forever, right? So he says that he remains a priest perpetually.
Right.
Okay, so continuously. Now, how is it that he was able to be a priest perpetually? Now, think about this for a second, because what was determined within the law about the high priest? Okay, now, if you were a Levite, You came into service as a priest at the age of 25 and you retired at 50, right? And that's set out in Numbers chapter 8.
Dang, I should be retired.
The high priest, though, served for life. And when you were getting ready to die, the high priesthood was bestowed upon the oldest son. Remember when Aaron's about to die? And they take him, Moses takes him up on Mount Horeb, and I think he says, bring Abiathar with you. And God tells him that he's going to die there, and Abiathar will become the high priest. Aaron went up the mountain as high priest. Abiathar came down the mountain as high priest. There was an exchange there where there was a time when Aaron ceased to be high priest. And it was bestowed on his son. Not so with Melchizedek. He dies in the office of high priest. Therefore, he remains a priest continuously. Okay, so let me give you an example of this, right? When I die, even though I am no longer here, my children, hopefully, will still refer to me as their mother. I will continue to be their mother until no one remembers who I am, right? I will hold that position perpetually because it's not going to be handed off to anybody else. No one else can be their mother, right? This is what the author's talking about with Melchizedek. Because his priesthood was not tied to a tribe or a family line, he died in that office and he retains that kind of title continuously. Until today.
All right, there's back in the book.
Okay, see? Yeah, because this is what's so interesting about Melchizedek, because here you have a priesthood, and that's what the author's trying to convey to these Jews. There were priesthoods that were in play long before the Levitical priesthood or the Aaronic priesthood. There was Melchizedek, there was Jethro. Remember Moses' father-in-law is a priest of Midian. Okay, now these priesthoods could be legitimate priesthoods serving God, like what we see with Melchizedek, because he's a priest of El Elyon, the Most High God, right? But there are also counterfeit priests and priesthoods, like with the priests of Baal and all of that kind of thing. So, but what the author's trying to get them to understand is that there were priesthoods serving and ministering before God long before the order of Levi and Aaron. Okay? So, he goes on then. So, anything before we move on to verse 4? Are we good? Maybe. Tell me why maybe. You're waiting to see.
Melchizedek is a pretty cool dude.
He is. Okay, see, yes, you want him to stay that way because he is. See, I think this is what's so amazing. That somehow his name reflects how God sees him. The name peace for his kingdom reflects something about who he is as a king. And what the author says that he is like Christ, he's being compared to Christ. And so then the question is, okay, what are the other ways that he becomes compared to Christ? And I think that's what's really interesting, because the author goes back and he says, now observe how great this man was, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth of the choice spoils.
I don't really know that I understand that statement. I mean, I know that Abraham gave him 10% of what he.
Okay.
But what was it that made that happen?
All right, let me tell you.
Well, I want you to back it up.
I
don't want to
always
hear
try
what you tell
to.
me. I want to see what
Okay?
you see.
All right, now, the reason that we don't understand this is because we do not function in ancient warfare. You got the spoils of war. You got to strip your enemy of his clothing, his shoes, his weapons, his horses. All of that was a spoil of war, right? And you got to take that with you. And what we see here is that you paid a tithe in recognition, when you came in front of someone that you recognized was superior to you, you brought them a gift. Right? So if you came into the presence of a king, you never came into the presence of a king empty-handed. You brought them something to show that you understood that they were superior to you in their office and their position.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay? So when Abraham meets Melchizedek, right, and in the narrative in chapter 14, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of them come out. Melchizedek comes out from Salem. He brings wine and he brings bread. And Abram, at the moment he meets him, understands that he is standing in the presence of someone amazing. Right? That he serves the God that Abraham worships in a way that Abraham will never serve him.
Yeah, no, and I thought of that,
Yeah.
that they were probably having some conversations that made Abraham realize, or Abram at the time, understand that he knows the same God that's been talking to him.
Exactly. And he serves him in a greater capacity than what Abraham does.
Right.
Which is remarkable.
Isn't it remarkable?
It really truly is.
It really truly is. And it goes against that whole narrative that God didn't have any interaction with anybody until Abraham. Because what you see is that he's obviously had this interaction with Melchizedek. He's told him how people should worship him. He's done all of that kind of thing. But the thing is when Abraham comes into the presence of this great king priest, what does Abraham, out of, in a sense, social obligation, do
Gives
at that
him a
moment?
gift.
He gives him a gift. And he gives him a tenth of the best stuff off the top of the pile that they hauled back from the slaughter of the Macedonian kings. Right? Now, what's really interesting about it is that it goes on and it says, and the author makes it very clear to remind them, how do the Jews see Abraham?
As
Abraham, their father, right? Abraham, the father, this is how he responded to Melchizedek. So then he goes on and he says, and indeed the sons of Levi, who received the priest's office, have commandment in the law to collect a tenth from the people, that is from their brethren, although these are descended from Abraham. Now, this is a contrast that he's showing. Because why is it that the Levites are able to collect a tithe from the other tribes of Israel? What gives them the authority to do that? Is it based upon their rank and superiority, or is it based on something else?
It's based on the command that God said that they're gonna pay them.
Exactly.
Mhm.
It's based upon the law. And so basically what it is, it's peers paying peers a tithe. And that's what he says, that you get this tithe from your brethren. There's nothing any more exceptional about the people in the tribe of Levi and the line of Aaron than there is about any other Israelite in a sense, except that they have been designated by God to serve in this capacity. Right? So with Abraham, he was paying the tithe to someone that he recognized as a spiritual superior. The tribes of Israel pay their tithes
Because they're told to.
because they're told to under the law, but there's no recognition in a sense. Now, they act on behalf of the people in regard to their worship of God, but nowhere do we ever see that the tribe of Levi is said to be superior spiritually to the other people of Israel. Okay? So he says, that's one of the things is the differences between the priesthood. One, a gift was given out of recognition of the superiority of the priesthood. The other, the gift is given out of commandment given in the law. So there are two different reasons as to why the tithe is given. Thoughts? Are we good?
Recap that again. So, he gave to Melchizedek because he saw that he was, spiritually got
Yes.
something going on. And
Yes.
the other ones obviously are they tithe because they've been told to tithe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The
They
tithe
both
is, the
receive
tithe,
and
yeah, The tithe is what they give to the tribe of Levi for caring for them spiritually. Because they didn't get an inheritance. God is their inheritance. So the rest of the tribes are told in the law, you're going to take care of the needs of the tribe of Levi because they minister before me on your behalf. Right? But there's never any place that says anything about them being more spiritually superior or anything like that to their brothers. Okay? So then the author goes on in verse 6, he says, but the one whose genealogy is not traced from them, who is the them here?
The Levites.
The Levites, and who's the one whose genealogy is not traced from them?
Oh, oops.
Melchizedek.
Okay.
Okay, so when Melchizedek is not traced from them, collected a tenth from Abraham, and blessed the one who had the promises. Okay, now, this was in a way how it works, and you see hints of this in the Old Testament, right? What it was is that someone would bring the gift, as Abraham brings the gift to Melchizedek. If Melchizedek accepts that gift, he's taking on the responsibility then to pray for and to intercede, in a sense, on Abraham's part before God, to fulfill the office of priest, right? So when it says that he blessed him, when Melchizedek looks at Abraham, whatever he said to Abraham as that blessing, what Melchizedek is accepting the responsibility of his priesthood in regards to his ministering at that moment to Abraham. Okay? Now, you have the same scenario at the beginning of the book of Samuel when Hannah is at the tabernacle and she's crying because she doesn't have a child, and she has an interaction with Eli. And Eli basically pronounces, he says, go in peace. I pray that the Lord will hear your prayer, that he will answer the desire of your heart, which is that you would have a child. We read that going, well, he's just having a conversation with her. But in all reality, what he's doing is, as the priest, he's pronouncing a blessing on her. That she will gain what she's asking God for. Right? So when it says that Abraham paid the tithe, and then Melchizedek responded by blessing him, what you're seeing is this interaction between priest and basically person who's engaging God through this priest at the time. Now, what did Abraham know about Melchizedek? See, this is the point that the author's trying to get across to the Jews that are listening to him. What did their father understand about Melchizedek when he stood in his presence?
That he represented God.
He represented God. He was an important man. He was a spiritual superior, right? And this is what what Abraham understood. So then the author goes on and he says, but without any dispute, in verse 7, the lesser, who is the lesser?
Abraham.
Abraham is blessed by the who? The greater Melchizedek. Okay, now, so what has the author, okay, so if you were a Jew sitting there listening to this, what would your thought be?
No.
Isn't Abraham supposed to be
What-
great?
Yeah.
No one's greater than Father Abraham. No, but it's documented where? In chapter 14 of Genesis, by Moses, the great prophet. So what do they see? This is what's so beautiful about this passage. Because how the author lays it out, step by step, of what happened in that, they can't refute the whole discussion that the author is laying out before them. But here, the father of who we are, our patriarch, our great father, he came in contact with someone who he recognized to be his spiritual superior. Okay? Now, remember, it's in this priesthood according to Melchizedek, not according to who?
Abraham.
Abraham or his sons. And that's why the author goes on. He says in verse 8, now in this case, mortal men receive tithes, but in that case, one of them of whom is witness that he lives on, and so to speak, through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, paid tithes, for he was in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Right? So, what's interesting in verse 8, the author, when he says, in this case, mortal men, right, men that can die, he's making a distinction in time frames. And what's interesting is that the word here for receives, in this case, mortal men receive tithes, is in the present tense. So he's talking about the priesthood that is functioning at that moment. Right? Now remember, we said in the context of Hebrews when we first started that what was probably still functioning at the time that the author wrote the book of Hebrews? The temple. Okay?
But let's break that down again. So, verse 8, I'm reading on the NIV here, but in the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die. So that's
Right.
obviously the Levites, they're dying,
Yeah.
the peeps
That are
dying.
still functioning at that
But in
time.
the other case, by him who is declared to be living.
Okay.
So that, again, going back to my original thing, kind of indicates that, yeah,
Okay.
we know he was a real person, but Jesus was a real person.
Okay. So, but in that case, the case of who?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. Right? Because who's the discussion about?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. Right? So in the case of priests now, they receive tithes. They continue to receive tithes.
Mhm.
But in that case, the case of Melchizedek, one of them of whom is this witness that he lives on, in what capacity? As a priest.
Whoa, hold it, where,
In that perpetual priesthood.
and you're in verse 8?
Yes.
Alright, so let me look at it on this and see if this clarifies that. So, no, it still doesn't clarify. So in this case, I have that underlined here in my work
Mhm.
today. In this case, mortal men receive tithes,
Okay,
but in that case, one
Right.
receives them of whom it is witness that he lives on.
okay,
So,
what was just said in verse 3 about Melchizedek? He is a priest perpetually, continuously. Okay, and this is, okay, so this is an interesting thing. Do you remember, now, hear me out here, but do you remember when Moses and God had their first interaction and he says that I am the God of your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And then he makes the comment later on when he's talking to Moses, he says, I am the God of the living.
yeah.
Okay, Melchizedek, it would seem, falls into that same category.
Now, that makes sense. I mean, that makes
Okay.
sense, because they're not on our realm, they're
Right,
still
that
living.
doesn't
To
mean
God, they're still living,
they're
they're
still
with him.
living.
I get that.
Okay,
Yeah.
so if you were gonna have a name tag, if Melchizedek was gonna have a name tag, you know, that clarified what he did and what he still functions as in heaven, what would it say? Priest.
With
Okay.
a perpetual time clock.
Yeah, perpetual
Sand does
priest.
not run out.
Yeah, see, this is because this is the whole picture that the author is showing them about Melchizedek, because he's not bound to the Mosaic law and to the priesthood that is connected to the Mosaic law. He can be referred to as a priest forever, just as long as I can be referred to as the mother of my children, for as long as my children have grandchildren, and they have grandchildren, and they have grandchildren, I'm still mother. Right? And so this is what the author wants them to understand. And because of that, in a sense, when Abraham paid that tithe to Melchizedek, even though Levi wasn't actually born, he was still where?
The loins of Abraham.
In the loins of Abraham, right? And so what the author is trying to get them to understand was that the action of the father or the ancestor was an action that the descendants did as well. So what the author is telling them is that when you go along that line of thought, that the Levites, who are given a tithe by the children of Israel, actually in a sense paid a tithe through Abraham to one that they acknowledge as greater than themselves. Now, do you remember that? Don't drift away. If you deny Christ, there's no ability for you to be brought back to repentance. What has this author just closed the door on right now regarding priesthoods?
That it's null and void except for Christ.
Exactly. Exactly. And in case they didn't understand that, what does he say in verse 11? Now, he kind of encapsulates all of it in verse 11, and he says, now if perfection was through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the people received the law, what further need was there for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be designated according to the order of Aaron?
Okay, hold on a second here. Let's go back here and look at verse 9.
Okay?
One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, okay, paid the tenth through Abraham, so we're looking back in time,
Mhm.
that because, it's a genetic
Because
thing, and he was in
Abraham
his
did it,
loins.
his descendants in a sense did it.
Because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Okay, cool.
Right.
I get that.
Okay.
But I don't see where if I was a Jewish Christian sitting in this congregation, I would totally be able to draw that line up and say, okay, well, he just knocked that thing right.
Okay, because how he knocks it out is in verse 11. Now, if perfection, and remember perfection here is completeness, reaching your goal, right? What is the perfection that we're headed towards? What is it that we want for God to say about us? What was it that he said about Abraham in chapter 15 that changed the entire perspective of how
That
God
you're
saw
righteous.
him? Righteous. How was Melchizedek described?
As righteous.
As the king, as righteous, right?
Right.
So if righteousness, which is what we were wanting, if imperfection was through the Levitical priesthood, the question is, why would there come another priesthood?
Correct, that's a good question.
According to the order of Melchizedek, right? So then the author goes on to answer the question. And the answer to the question is, in verse 12, for when the priesthood is changed, of necessity there takes place a change of law also. So what does the author say right there? Are bound together, cannot be separated without both of them being changed,
The priesthood and the law.
and the law. So basically, now that he said that there's a different order that has come in through Christ, because remember, that's what he said at the end in chapter 5, before he took his little detour, that Christ is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. If the priesthood has changed, then what is the author saying has to change as well?
You know what the whole,
The law.
okay, so this all comes to mind, or wraps up very clearly for me, when in verse 11 towards the end, it says, why was there still a need for another priest to come? One,
Yes.
in the order
Order
of
of
Melchizedek, not
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek himself, but
Yes.
like Melchizedek.
But like
If I'd have seen
Melchizedek.
that, I wouldn't have had these questions, okay?
Yeah, well, there you go.
Let's move
Okay?
on.
Because the word order there means to come down from. All right? So this is what the author is telling them. They need to remember that the Levitical priesthood was tied to something very specific. And that specific thing was what? The Mosaic Law. Right? And what he showed them is that there was a priesthood that existed long before the Mosaic Law, that God recognized as a legitimate priesthood, interacted with this man as a legitimate priest. Abraham recognized him to be a priest, and he had no connection to the Levites, to the Aaronic priesthood, or to the law. Now, if you were a Jew hearing that, what would you think?
Yeah, what he said.
I mean, I think more than I would think, I can't listen to you anymore. Because
Too much of a shift.
if what you are saying is true, you are asking me to believe something that will totally change how I live my life from the moment I wake up in the morning until the moment I close my eyes at night. You are asking me to totally change my framework of how I see myself as righteous before God.
That's why I have said before to you and to even in this class that I think for a Jewish Christian, especially in this era, it was much harder for them than it is for us, because for us it's only been what it is. It's not the new covenant, it's the covenant.
Correct. See, this is what I want to point out to you. That for them, with this discussion of the removing of the law and bringing in a new priesthood and getting rid of one covenant and the establishing of a new covenant, this was a concept they were like, how can this be? Right? Because the law is what made it possible for them to approach God. For the high priest, that's how they got their sins taken care of. Everything was through that high priest. Now the author's telling them, guess what you don't need any longer? You don't need a high priest like that. Right? And that's why, okay, so my watch is dead. Somebody give me, what?
7:26.
Good, all right. Somebody give me like a 5-minute, 5 to 8 time thing. Okay, so in verse 12 he says, for when the priesthood is changed of necessity, not just because we want to, but necessity, there takes place a change of law also. Now he starts talking about the new priest, but what's interesting, he doesn't just say, now regarding Jesus, right? He says, for the one concerning whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no one has officiated at the altar. Now, the one concerning whom these things were spoken was back when he referenced in chapter 4, when it said, and you will be a priest like Melchizedek forever. Right? Who was that statement made about? Jesus, the Son. Right? So he says, for the one concerning whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe from which no one has officiated at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, a tribe with reference to which Moses spoke nothing concerning priests. And it is clearer still, if another priest arises according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become one such not on the basis of a law of physical requirements, but according to the power of an indestructible life, for it is attested of him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Okay. There are 3 things here that the author is saying, because of this change, these 3 primary things have to change. Right? The first thing he says, for concerning the one whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe. Then, now remember, he's identified Jesus as the priest after the order of Melchizedek. But what tribe does Jesus belong to? Judah. Now, what's interesting about this, though, do you remember Melchizedek is a priest king? Judah is the kingly tribe. It's the tribe of David. So what is the author talking about when he brings in this discussion about the one whom this is concerning? He is not going to be like the tribe of Levi, from the tribe of Levi, because there is no discussion about that tribe ever holding what office? Kingship. So what you see here is that there's a change of tribe because there's a change of priesthood, that Jesus will serve as a priest king. Yes. Okay?
What was that, Carl? What'd you say?
First one's a
Is a change of the tribe. Okay?
Who could be priest?
Right. Who could be priest? But actually, then the next one, what we see is that The only reason that the priesthood can be changed is because what do the authors say in verse 12 is going to change? Of necessity, they're taking the law. Right? So there's gonna be a change in law, and part of the change then, there's gonna be a change in the priesthood, and now a king can become priest, which was, do you guys remember when we were studying in chapter 4, do you remember we looked at the incident, I think was it Abijah, who was a godly man and all that, but then he decided one day he was gonna go into the temple and he was gonna offer the incense, do what the priests were supposed to do. And do you remember the priests are all like, you can't be in here, you can't do this, you cannot do what we have been called to do, and then God strikes him with leprosy?
Yeah.
Remember? And so see, this was something that was very important for them to understand. If the law would change, then it could come about that the tribe that held the priesthood could change, and you could have those two things merged once again, like they were merged in Melchizedek. And Melchizedek's name meant what?
King of peace.
King of righteousness.
Righteousness and King of peace. Now, who's Christ?
King of peace.
Okay, so you have a change of the covenant, you have a change of the tribe that can serve as priest. Now you have the tribe of the king can serve as priest, and then ultimately you have the change of the priesthood. Because he goes on where he says, and it is clear still, if another priest arises, right? So this is signaling the change of the priesthood according to the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become such, right, this different priest, who has become such not on the basis of a law of physical requirement. What was the line, the whole Levitical priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood based on?
Physical
Physical requirement, right? You had to be of the tribe of Levi, and you had to be the tribe of Aaron, or the family of Aaron. He says, but according to the power of an indestructible life. This is what makes this new king priest. Now, the word for power here is the word dunamis, which we see all the time in the New Testament, which carries with it the idea of inherent power. It's power residing in the nature of who the person is or the thing is. It's inherent power residing within them, right? The idea here of indestructible life just means endless. It cannot be destroyed.
But okay, so this brings up another question though, that it's not directly related to this, but, well, it kinda is though. So we know that when David brought back the ark, you know, and he's got the right people in there doing it, and he puts on the priestly tunic, and he's dancing around, and all of that kind of thing, as the tunic, or as the thing comes in.
Dark.
But I don't understand, because we also know that David
Okay.
could not.
It doesn't say the priestly tunic, it says he put on an ephod.
Yeah, okay.
Ephod just means robe.
All right. So he did that. But there is, so we know that David constantly would talk. You know, he would have prophets come and talk to him. He would work through the high priests or the priests and do all of that kind of stuff. And I'll kind of answer my own questions as we go. So let's just move on, and I'll come back to it because it actually does apply. Because we're talking about how in the
No,
old,
it does not apply to David.
No, I know, but what I'm saying is it applies to that what we were talking about, that from the time of Melchizedek up to the time of Jesus, that only after Melchizedek, all the Levitical stuff, the kings could never approach. They had to go through the through the tribe of Levi.
Okay, and what designated that?
The law.
The law,
Right.
right? So this is what the author is saying. If there's a change in what the law says about priesthood, if there's a change in the law regarding the covenant, if there's a change in that, then you have a whole new priesthood that you're looking at.
Correct.
Because what the priesthood is bound to now is that Mosaic covenant. But what does the author say at the end of chapter 8 about that Mosaic covenant?
It's over.
It's done. Right? So basically, he's building this case that even if you wanted to go back to Judaism, there's nothing to go back to. It's done. It's obsolete because you have a new king, you have a new priest, you have a new covenant. Right? But this is what the author's trying to convey to them. So what makes Jesus, and I think this is what's really interesting about this, what does he say about this power of this indestructible life? Why can't Jesus serve as a priest like Melchizedek, or Melchizedek in a sense, he dies in a sense holding the office of priesthood, but what does Jesus have? Does he die holding the office of priest, or does he live eternally holding that office?
Eternally.
He lives eternally holding that office because he is the only one who possesses the power of what kind of life?
An eternal.
An
I mean, a
indestructible life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indestructible.
Because did they try to kill him?
Yep.
Yes, they did. They gave it their best shot. But what happened 3 days later?
They weren't successful.
They were not successful because of the inherent power of who he is as God.
Correct.
So that's why the author goes on and he says, for it is attested to him, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So how long is Jesus' priesthood going to last?
Forever.
Forever. In the order of who?
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek. Now, he goes on and he says, for on the one hand, there is a setting aside of the former commandment. The word here in the Greek for setting aside is annulment, right? It's the legal term for a complete cancellation. So he says, so there's a setting aside of a former commandment. What is the former commandment that is being set aside because it's being canceled?
The first covenant, the law at
Yes,
Sinai.
the law at Sinai. It says, because of its weakness and its uselessness. Okay, so when he says that the former commandment was weak and useless, does that say that there was something wrong with that commandment?
No wrong with it, it just didn't say.
Right. Because, okay, now what did the author tell us in verse 11? What could it not do?
Save.
It couldn't bring about the completion that man needs, right? So this idea of being weak, the weakness here, it means it has no strength to impart anything to something. So basically when it says it's weak, it has no strength imparted to fulfill the commands, and since there was no strength, the law couldn't justify, it couldn't sanctify, it couldn't do anything like that. All the law could do was do what? Like, even when you read, point it out, that's all the law could do.
Who looked at cavity?
Yeah, it didn't have any power. Did you ever notice that the law never tells anybody how to become righteous?
Because it can't.
It can't. See, that's not what it was created for. What it was created for was to show man his need to have God redeem him.
Just like it talks about in Romans.
Just like it talks about in Romans, right? That was there. So when it's talking about weakness and uselessness, it's not talking that the law had no value, but in its very creation, it was created for a specific purpose, and that was to point out the need for a redeemer, right? So the law wasn't supposed to bring about completion. It was just supposed to point out our need for completion. And then when he says that it's useless, the word useless here means it's not beneficial. And it's not talking about that I couldn't learn anything from the law, but the law didn't make me righteous. All it did continuously was point out how unrighteous I am. But it couldn't come and say, okay, now if you do this, this, and this, righteousness is now bestowed on you. So it had no strength to change us. It had no ability to be a benefit to us regarding our righteousness. All it could do is point out our shortcomings and then tell us what we needed to get right with God, which was carried out through the priesthood. Right? But he's not saying that the law was inferior in some way. He's just saying you need to understand what was the intention of the law. And so he says that it was, so in verse 18 he says, for on the one hand there is a setting aside of a former commandment because of its weakness and its uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. And that's the same word that we saw in verse 11. It brought nothing to completion. He says, and on the other hand, there is a bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God, and inasmuch as it is not without an oath. Now, what is the better hope? Jesus ministering as my what?
Your
High priest.
for
As
eternity.
my high priest for eternity. That's the better hope. Right? Because how is it that I can draw near to the Father?
Through him.
Through him.
Through him, because he's the one separating that veil and saying, draw near with confidence. Right? So then he goes on and he says, and if they indeed became priests without an oath, and the they here is the Levitical priesthood, but he with an oath through the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn, and I will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. Now, do you remember what we talked about last week that an oath is? Well, it's the guidelines around something, right? So it's kind of like the guidelines around a contract. Now, who is this oath to?
Okay, well, I'm quasi lost here for a second. We're starting on verse 20, right?
Yes. Okay, so he's still talking about the priesthood,
All right.
okay? The better hope is that we have a better priesthood. Then he goes on and he says, and this priesthood has been given an oath by God, where the Levitical priesthood was not given an oath by God. Right? And what is the oath that God has given to Jesus?
That he'll be a priest forever. He won't change his mind.
Exactly. And so what we see here is that this priesthood of Jesus's is eternal, it's permanent, and it's unchanging. But let me ask you, why the oath?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I have a thought, but go ahead. Why don't,
Well, no. Okay, see, I think this is interesting. Why the oath?
I am here, but I'm gonna hold on for 3 minutes.
Okay, it's a guarantee to who?
To us.
To Jesus. And what is the guarantee? Right. See, this is what I think is so beautiful about this. That the oath isn't just, it's given to Jesus, it's spoken about Jesus, but in reality, who does it give comfort to?
Us.
Us. Right? To us. Okay? Because he's saying it to Jesus. What is he telling Jesus about your priesthood?
It's never gonna change. You're always
It's
gonna be.
eternal, it's never changing, it will be there forever. And so he's telling Jesus, you will be able to minister in this capacity to these people forever. But then on the flip side of that, what is he telling me?
Yes.
I can count on it, and if I accept the work of Jesus Christ on my behalf, what do I know? I'm righteous, and not based on what I can do, but based on the work of who? Jesus.
Well, all right, let's stop there for a second, because I think that what this is saying is, you know, where it says there in verse 21, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. I think that really is not for Jesus. I think that's only for us. And I say that, let me tell you why I say that. Because we already know that from the beginning of time, the Trinity had already decided how this was gonna happen.
Okay, no, you're violating the text then,
Okay.
right?
Tell me how.
Because if you go back to verse 20, right? And inasmuch as it was not without an oath, for they indeed became priests without an oath, but he, Christ, with an oath, through the one who said to him, Christ, the Lord has sworn, and I will not change his mind, You are a priest forever. God the Father said
Oh.
that to who?
Christ the Son.
Christ the Son.
Or God.
That this will be a role that you will hold for eternity in regards to humanity. Now, the author's going to go on and he's going to build the case that the only reason he can hold that role because of the sacrifice that he's going to make and all of that kind of thing. But this is an oath that was sworn to Christ, but we become the beneficiaries of the oath. Because if he's serving as a priest forever, what does a priest do?
Intercedes.
Intercedes. Mediates. So the minute he gives Jesus that title of priest, it has something to do for us. It's beneficial for us. But the oath is made to Jesus. Forever. And through that oath then, the author goes on and he says in verse 22, inasmuch more also Jesus has become the guarantee of a better covenant. Now remember in verse 12, he said that if the priesthood changes, what else has to change?
The law.
The law has to change. So now we have the introduction of the better covenant. Now, what's really interesting is this word that Jesus has become the guarantee. The idea of guarantee in the Greek here is to mean to bail, like a bail bond kind of thing. It's the bail was someone who personally answers for someone, whether with his life or with his property. So you were placing collateral for that person. Okay? So in a sense, who is the collateral for the new covenant?
Jesus.
Jesus is. Right? And he goes on and he says, now, in chapter 8 is when he starts talking about this new covenant. But he says the former priests on the one hand existed in greater number because they were prevented by death from continuing. But Jesus, on the other hand, because he continues forever, he holds his priesthood how? Permanently. Now, therefore, he is able to save forever those who draw near to God. Now, right there, if you do not believe in eternal salvation or eternal security of your salvation, you have a problem. Because what does that verse say?
He always looks to intercede for them.
It says he is able to save
Completely.
forever those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to do what?
Make intercession.
To make intercession for them. Now, do you remember in chapter 4 where we talked about, the author talked about how precious humanity was to God?
Yeah.
Okay. For it was fitting for us to have such a high priest. What is God conveying there?
He loves us.
Yes, you are worth this kind of high priest. It was fitting for us to have this high priest, holy, innocent, undefiled, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, who does not need daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people, because this he did when? Once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men as high priests who are weak, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints a son made perfect for how long?
Forever.
Forever. Right? Now, as we close, what time is it?
7:49.
Okay. So first of all, what I think is interesting here is that the author goes back to this idea of when the high priest was basically consecrated before he was installed as high priest. Remember we read that they would be separated from the people for 7 days. They would wash, they would do all of that kind of thing. And he's basically going back to that understanding that Jesus fulfills that, but Jesus doesn't have to continuously go through that because of who he is. But I think it's interesting now, at the end of this, what are the points that the author is making super clear about this? Because like I said, he's gonna go on in chapter 8, and he's gonna say, now the main point in what we have said is this. We have such a high priest who has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the sanctuary and in the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched, not man. Right? So he wraps it all up there. But let me ask you, given where we live, right? Because we live among people who believe in 2 restored priesthoods. What are the 2 restored priesthoods that they believe in?
Melchizedek.
The Aaronic and the Melchizedek. Now, let me ask you, did the Melchizedek priesthood need to be restored?
No,
Why?
because Jesus did it once and for all, and everyone can intercede through him.
Okay, it was never lost,
No, that.
right? So when our Mormon family and friends and neighbors talk about the restored Melchizedek priesthood, they're talking about something that was never lost. There was no need for it to be restored. And when Christ assumed that priesthood, if I'm saying that it needs to be restored, what am I saying about Christ?
That he's nothing. That he's not. what
He's not
supposed to
enough, right?
be. Mhm.
Yeah, there's something inferior about who he is as he serves as priest, or else it wouldn't need to be restored,
Yeah.
right? So I think that this becomes a really interesting discussion to have with people who are LDS, because they need to understand that once that priesthood was restored through Jesus Christ, there was nothing that needed to be done after that, and the Melchizedek priesthood cannot be passed on to others.
Mhm. It's a perpetual.
Okay, so the Bible talks about in Peter and in Revelation that we are a kingdom of priests, right? But do we serve as priests in the same capacity that Jesus serves as a priest in the Melchizedek order?
No.
Negative.
No.
He's a high priest, and we are
Okay.
just regular priests.
That's it, all right? This is the difference. When we're called to be a kingdom of priests, basically, in a sense, we're serving as the Levites served the high priesthood,
Correct.
right? Jesus is there, he just tells us what to do, and what do we say?
Yes, sir.
Got it, right? And we go out and we do that. So that's how we can serve, but we do not serve under the order of Melchizedek.
No.
No one, the text right here makes it very clear, there is only one person who can serve under the order of Melchizedek, and that's who?
Christ.
Christ. And he will hold that priesthood for how long?
Forever.
Eternity.
So there's
For
no,
eternity, because he will never what?
Die.
Die.
and he's the only one that needs to do that.
Yeah. So see, this is what is interesting when people talk about the restored thing of Melchizedek. There is no need for the restoration. Okay. And I think that this is something that for a long time as Christians, we've kind of sidestepped and not really maybe talked to people about, because we had a hard time understanding what the purpose of Melchizedek was for ourselves. So we were always hesitant to maybe open up that door to ask somebody, tell me about the Melchizedek priesthood. What is it that you believe about the Melchizedek priesthood? And have them explain it to us.
And then we say, okay, now let's go to chapter 7 and look at something real carefully.
Okay, see, because I think that this is what's important. What happened was that someone trying to create a heresy took someone that is spoken of very little within the Bible and thought he could create a whole doctrine on that person, not really thinking, I don't think, that he understood the importance of who this person was in regards to the work of Christ. But in chapter 7, the author talks about that the priesthood of Christ that is like the order of Melchizedek. So therefore, that becomes a very serious point that we need to discuss with our Mormon friends and neighbors and family members. Right? Now, what about the Aaronic priesthood then?
Yeah, I don't even know really what is the Aaronic priesthood? I read it, don't know what it means. I mean, in the Bible, I understand it. I don't understand it from the Mormon perspective. What's it mean? Liz?
They would have to make the,
It's a lesser priesthood that you're given when you're 12. 11, it used to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, and it's,
did mature.
yeah.
It allows you to teach.
They would have to be from the tribe of Levi.
Okay, now, this is why I think it's important for us to remember to go to chapter 8, verse 13. And when he has said, okay, and you have this passage quoted from the Old Testament about the new covenant, he says, and when he said a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. What's the first covenant?
Law.
The law, and that includes what?
The
The
Aaronic
priesthood that goes along with the law. He has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to do what?
Disappear.
Disappear.
Not get reestablished.
Not be reestablished. Disappear.
Well, and so.
So there should never be any restoration of an Aaronic priesthood because it served its purpose. Its time frame was used up. It is now obsolete, and the Aaronic priesthood has nothing to do in regards to humanity's righteousness before God. So there's no need to restore it. Because what does the author of Hebrews say right there in that verse in chapter 8?
It's gonna disappear.
It's obsolete. It's going away. You cannot have two contracts at the same time with God. You can have the new covenant,
So,
or you can have the old covenant, but if you're functioning under the old covenant, what is your contract?
The law.
The law, and it's done. It's expired.
I know we're not here yet, so we'll probably cut this next week, but chapter 8, verse 13 is quasi-confusing. When he said a new covenant, he's made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is about to disappear. It has, in fact, at the time of this writing, disappeared.
Yes, but I think that because the author's gonna go on and he's gonna make the point, all right, and I think that this is why he's talking to that Jewish audience. If the temple though if they're still practicing at the temple, what is there an understanding is still here, but it's becoming obsolete, it's working its way out because of the work of Christ, but
But
they're
it's still
still,
in
the
effect.
Jews are still following it, so they don't see it as obsolete.
Yeah.
But there is the understanding that in 70 AD, when that temple is destroyed, the Jews at the time, pre-70 AD, when they read this verse, they may have had one understanding, but after 70 AD, what did they very clearly understand about that covenant?
Times has changed.
Yeah, there were components of that covenant that could no longer be practiced, and that was the priesthood and the sacrifices. So it could be in a sense that that's what the author is alluding to, is the destruction of the temple. But what we see here is that for us, this is what I think is so important, because when was the last time that you sat down with a Mormon friend and asked them what their thoughts were about the Melchizedek priesthood?
Maybe we should have said that.
I mean, when was, okay? And I mean, it doesn't have to be confrontational. I mean, you have the perfect opening here. You can say, wow, you know what? We're studying the book of Hebrews. We're studying about the Melchizedek priesthood. Do you believe in the Melchizedek priesthood? Oh yeah, I believe in the Melchizedek priesthood. I hold the Melchizedek priesthood. Tell me about it. What does it mean to you? How do you understand the Melchizedek priesthood? Okay? Because this is an important thing. And I think that so many times, out of our lack of understanding of it ourselves, we haven't tread into that territory. So what I'm encouraging you to do is walk in. Because we've been studying it, it's a very easy transition with somebody who's afraid. Just ask them. What is your understanding of the Melchizedek priesthood? What do you think it means? Why did it have to be restored? Why did all these things need to happen? Because Hebrews chapter 7 very clearly says that there's only one person who can hold that priesthood. And that's who? Jesus. So, yeah. And just kind of let them tell you what they think about it. Right? So, any thoughts as we close tonight? Did we, Melchizedek again? I mean, we kind of squashed him and then we had to pump him back up again. And now Melchizedek is pumped up in all of his glory. Yeah, so that is, yeah. Okay, so next week we're gonna talk about covenant. So we're gonna look at chapter 8. We're gonna do that, so yeah. So next week is Old Covenant, New Covenant. So, are you ready to go home?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for this time that we've been able to be together tonight. And Father, we thank you for this chapter that this author wrote in chapter 7. We thank you for moving him to pen this so many years ago. And Father, just where we live, the understanding of this passage is so important to us. And so, Lord, let us use it as we engage our neighbors and our friends and family members. And let's just help them understand what is the true meaning of the Melchizedek priesthood and who is the only person who can hold that. And Father, I just thank you because this truly is meat. This isn't milk, this is meat. So help us to process it this week. Help us to just kind of have this as a foundation as we move on. And just at some point, Father, just help us to come before you and just sit in awe and gratitude of what you have provided for us through the work of your Son. And Lord Jesus, we thank you that you were willing to hold this office for us forever. That not only were you willing to make that propitiation for us and to make the justification for our sins, but also that you were willing to minister on our behalf forever. And so we ask that in moments of despair, in moments of time where we feel like no one cares and that we're so small and so isolated, that that we're all alone, that we would remember that verse, that no one can take this from it, and it was fitting for us to have such a high priest as this. And the Father, that we would remember how important we are to you because of who you sent to act on our behalf. And so I just ask now that you would just watch over everyone, that you would take them home safely. And Father, that you would just give us all a wonderful time in your word this week. And that we would be excited to come back and share what we've learned with each other. And we thank you for all of this through Christ. Amen. Everyone be